Oh, and I think we're live, which leads me to say hello and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today it's the Saturday stream, as distinct from the Sunday stream. So, welcome. Pardon me. So today I want to talk about what happened to rock and roll. Why did rock and roll die? How? When? And all of the other buts, whys, wherefores, and what's its. So, to really understand this, we need to kind of explore what a genre is. Now, generally in musicology, a genre tends to be defined by its musical characteristics in terms of composition, in terms of theory, in terms of arrangement, in terms of instrumentation, which is, of course, related to arrangement, and in terms of performance style. But I think we could find a better definition. And this one doesn't come from me, it comes from Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa defined genres less by who they were performed by, less by the qualities of the music themselves, and more by who was consuming them. In other words, a genre really only comes into existence when you can identify a demographic that likes a certain set of artists or a certain set of albums, etc. And I actually think that's a much more accurate way to define genres. And there's a musically valid reason, which is because if we value invention and individuality and originality, then by definition, every single artist and each one of his or her compositions is going to be unique. What might not be unique is the fact that someone within a particular economic, social, age, racial, etc. demographic has certain albums. So, in other words, let's say that you were a black 21-year-old living in Detroit in 1975. You can statistically make generalizations about the albums he would have. He would more likely have an Isaac Hayes album than an Arlo Guthrie album. He would more likely have a Parliament Funkadelic album than a Kenny Rogers album. There are, of course, exceptions, but this is how advertising works. You have to find demographics. Likewise, a white kid from Boston who's 19 in 1978, he'll probably have a record by Boston, a record by Foreigner, that type of thing. His sister, on the other hand, might be more into disco, might be more into someone like Helen Reddy, Linda Ronstadt, and of course, there's always mixtures. And of course, their father and their mother have different tastes totally because of their respective generations. And so genres, I think, are much better defined by demographics that are used in advertising and statistics than they are in looking at the different theoretical differences between different music artists. So, with that proviso out of the way, let's look at the average length of a genre being popular because genres never go away. I mean, you can find people playing sort of music from the Renaissance period with lutes and things like that. Richie Blackmore left rock and roll to do that, but you cannot call that popular music. It exists on recordings because people in the modern age have recorded it, and you can go to some Renaissance festival to see people, the men in tights playing lutes and all of the rest of it. But it isn't pop music, and pop music changes. It has to do with a critical mass of one identifiable style of music and their consumer base. Always comes back to the consumer base that reached, as I said, a critical mass of consumption of that particular kind of music. And I want to define, as I said earlier, kind of music in as broad a term as possible. So let's look at the idiom of jazz and when that dominated pop music. Now, like rock and roll, like country and western, like classical, like any genre, there are so many subgenres which, on a day to day and year to year basis, are much more important than the macro genre. Yet for the purposes of this video, I want to focus on the macro. So let's look at ragtime, which was one of the first pop music iterations that hinted at the style we would later consider jazz, in the same way that blues hinted at what we would later consider the development of rock. So ragtime came about in the first sort of 20 years, the first 15 years really of the 20th century. In fact, let's look at when Scott Joplin wrote The Entertainer, which wasn't jazz in the way we think of it, but ragtime was the immediate predecessor to jazz, in the same way that R&B and before that blues were the predecessors to rock and roll. So this was 1902. So we can say that that is when things that had the aroma of jazz started to creep into the popular music world. And the sort of movement of trad jazz, which most people consider the true beginning of jazz as a popular idiom, we can trace to New Orleans in the 1920s and the years immediately before. Now, some of that was Dixie jazz. There were various iterations. Then in the 30s, you have the emergence of big band jazz, which carried forward into the 40s when the bands got slightly smaller, but the idea of swing was still very much the thing. In the late 40s, you got bebop. Now, that is an interesting development because it was at that moment that jazz began its gradual decline as a standalone genre. In other words, Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman were more in the pop world than were people like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, the great sort of founders, if you will, of bebop. Miles Davis was obviously there early on as well. He outlived them and did a lot more with it. But even as jazz as a kind of standalone musical idiom was becoming more niche and more refined and more of a musician's genre by the late 40s and early 50s, the jazz idiom continued to be pervasive throughout pop music. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that when you listen to a song by Frank Sinatra or by Dean Martin or by Bing Crosby in the mid or late 1950s, or even in the early, in some cases, the mid 1960s, you would see that it was still defined by the jazz idiom. It was swinging. You could snap your fingers to it. I mean, you could snap your fingers to anything, but I think you know what I'm getting at. You had arrangers and musical collaborators that were very much from the jazz world. People like Duke Ellington, people like Count Basie, who collaborated with Sinatra well into the 60s. And then by the late 60s, a genre that began in the early to mid 1950s took over as the main idiom of pop music. Things were a bit less swinging, and even people like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin were singing the songs with a rock and roll style backbeat. So less about snapping the fingers, more about mm, mm. Again, that's a crude definition, but again, you know instinctively if you've heard this music exactly what I'm referring to. And so let's look at the timeline then for jazz. If you want to say that jazz began as we know it in the 1920s, let's see how long it lasted in terms of the musical idiom that primarily defined pop music. So, well, let's begin in the 20s, so 30s, 40s, 50s. Give or take 40 years. And if you want to say that jazz in its sort of early forms could trace its roots to ragtime, we could really say that it lasted for 60 years. So anywhere between 45 and 60 years, the better part of a half century. Not bad in terms of a musical idiom defining pop music. That was a whole lot of jazz. Obviously, it was invented as an artistic form by Black American artists, then later popularized. Some would use the term, what's that word? They don't talk about it so much anymore. Appropriated by white artists in America, and then it went global. There was jazz in Western Europe, in communist Europe. There was jazz in Japan, jazz in China, jazz everywhere. So that's a pretty good run in terms of a musical idiom. So let's look at when rock began to define pop music. In other words, when you were listening to the top 10 singles, did it have more of a rock and roll backbeat? Was there an electric guitar on the album? Or was it still swinging? Did it have horns, saxophone as the most identifiable instrument as opposed to the electric guitar? Let's just say, for the purposes of simplicity, that this happened somewhere around 1965 and 1966. And rock had a really good run. It didn't exist in a vacuum. There was an entire soul, R&B, and funk era and disco era that was really huge, simultaneous to rock, but in many ways the differences were more racial and stylistic than they were in terms of the overall idiom. And so let's just, for the purposes of simplicity, say the rock, pop, R&B, and soul era. Because if you went to a record store anytime from the sort of 70s to the early 2000s, you would find that while jazz had its own little ghetto and classical had its own little ghetto and country, the majority of the floor space at your average, let's say, Tower Records was devoted to what they called rock, pop, soul, and R&B. And that's because when you combine those, you got the pop idiom that sustained the pop music world beginning in the 1960s and ending, well, we're going to find that out. Now, rock and roll was the dominant genre in at least half of the 60s, all of the 70s, and all of the 80s. In the 90s, it got seriously challenged by hip hop, although it still remained just about the primary idiom of pop music. Although you could really say that by the mid 90s, if you were looking at the top 10 singles, you could say that on average, maybe 5 of them involved sort of backbeats and electric guitars, and the other had more funk-derived drum machine beats and the synthesizers associated with the contemporary R&B of the 1990s. By the 2000s, rock and roll definitely started to go on the retreat. There were still rock bands hitting the charts, Coldplay being one of the ones that dominated the early 2000s. You could call them soft rock. That's what I would personally call them. But in that rock idiom, nevertheless, if Barry Manilow and Air Supply are in the broader rock idiom from the soft rock side, then certainly Coldplay is no more hard or soft than them, if you ask me. But they were one of the last sort of bands from that rock idiom to really dominate the pop charts. And the trajectory from the early 2000s up to the 20 teens, I guess you would call them, would be for pop music to arise at the top of the charts that was really dominated in terms of the musical style by a R&B style of arrangement, of production, of composition. So let's calculate the years. Let's say 1965 to 2008, the Great Recession. So let's just do the mathematics now to get an exact calculation. So 42 years. Depending on when you count the beginning of jazz as a major musical idiom in pop music, you could say that rock and roll had roughly the same period of domination in the pop charts as did jazz. Or if you go back to ragtime as the beginning of jazz, you could say that jazz had a good extra 20 years on rock and roll in terms of dominating the pop charts. Now, what does this mean? Well, at sort of an interesting observational level, you could say be careful of what you wish for, because I don't know of any genre whose music proclaims itself more than rock and roll. Now, what do I mean by that? We're gonna rock around the clock. Hey, hey, my, rock and roll will never die. Rock and roll is here to stay. Long live rock and roll all night and party every day. King of rock. That was actually a hip hop album. I just threw that in there to confuse you. But the point is, there aren't many lyrics in the jazz world that go, jazz will never die. Swing is here to stay. And yeah, in the early days of hip hop, things like the Sugar Hill Gang, you have hip hop, a hip it to the hip, and a hip hop, and it don't stop. But once you got into a more conscious form and a more confident form of hip hop, you really don't have that. In country western, you don't hear a lot of this genre will never die. You might hear stuff about never dying at the Alamo, but the genre itself. So rock and roll was very self-aware from the beginning, and some of that was organic. Some of that later became marketing, but nevertheless, it's one of those things. If you're going to be overly self-aware, then you're going to face a level of embarrassment when things don't go your way. I mean, John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, said it best in many ways. He said that one of the most embarrassing lyrics in rock and roll is from the Who song, and it's a great song, "My Generation," because the line is, "I hope I die before I get old." Now imagine singing that as a 70-year-old man, and I think that Pete Townsend is in his late 70s. Long may he continue to rock. But when you're sort of 19 and singing that song, or 18, it makes a lot of sense. But when you're singing it at the age of 70 and charging people $100 to hear you sing it, not as well as you did in 1966, then a level of parody, of accidental parody, comes into it. Same with Neil Young. I mean, just look at him in terms of his personal attributes. He used to rebel against advertising. He wrote the song "This Note's for You" specifically to campaign against the "This Bud's for You" ad campaign, where you had famous musicians recruited to sing about Budweiser. A successful ad, unlike some of the more recent Budweiser ads that have been a bit less successful. And what's Neil Young doing now? He's boycotting, or he dropped his boycott, but a few years ago he boycotted Spotify because of several products made by several major publicly traded companies that I believe have a bigger market cap than AB InBev, the parent company of Budweiser. So you can say that there is hypocrisy in rock and roll. I mean, there's hypocrisy in every genre, but because so many rock and roll lyrics were so self-aware, it unfortunately leaves a lot of great rock musicians open to the allegation of hypocrisy more than in other genres. Vocal jazz, like I said, you could say that scat is sort of a self-proclamation, but because by definition it is a non-lyrical form of vocal music, it doesn't have the same effect of "rock and roll will never die and I hope I die before I get old." And so maybe every genre of music has a certain defined period where it's really big. And the only antidote against that might be having your music relegated to something that isn't the defining medium of pop music. If Murphy's Law is true about accidents waiting to happen, then I suppose you could say that the Adams Music Box law of genres is that be careful, because if your genre defines the pop idiom, when it crashes out, it will crash long and hard. Now, let's think about a lot of that is sort of theoretical and historical, and I guess most of you are probably asleep by now. But let's just take a look at it in the real world and see what we mean. Now, anyone born from the 1940s, the boomers who were born then, okay, boomer, up to someone, let's say, born in the at least up to the early 1990s, if as a teen you were to say that really rocks, you're a rock star, you've got a rock and roll attitude, that would mean something definitive, and it would almost always have a positive connotation. You're parting like a rock star. Now, if you were to go up to someone who's, let's say, 20 in the year 2025, which means that they would have been born in 2005, just when rock and roll was sort of ceasing to be this sort of defining idiom of pop music, they might not have as strong a social connotation with that phrase, you rock, these phrases, you rock, you're a rock star, party like a rock star, I want to rock and roll all night. Because for them, rock and roll either means nothing or it means my father or grandfather going to see someone even older than him for a price that that generation cannot afford, because the boomers who grew up listening to rock and roll destroyed the economy for them in the Great Recession. So much for hoping you'd. These just people hope that they can afford a mortgage before they get old. It's a very different generation. And I feel sorry for them. The boomers had it much, much better economically, arguably musically. And I think George Carlin had some very good observations about that particular social cohort. Again, it all goes back to be careful what you wish for. If you have it good, the law of probability says that the next generation might have it worse. And indeed, except for countries like the US, in the 19th and 20th centuries, in the wider world, things don't always get better. Teleology is a very oversold ideology. Maybe that's hip hop. But getting back to it, let's try to play the same game, particularly for our older viewers, in terms of the jazz audience. Now, in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, that you're a hep cat. That swings, baby, and all of that stuff. And that wasn't really the rock and roll idiom. Sometime along the road of jazz going down in terms of its prominence in the pop world and rock going up in its prominence in the pop world, the hip cats and that swings gave way to that rocks, man. And so you can see that the linguistic idiomatic expressions change along with the music. Now, what has been the most dominant form of music that has influenced the slang, the idioms of the people today? Well, that is hip hop. People aren't taking their slang from the jazz world, and they're not taking it from the rock world. When people talk, oh, that he's so cooked, or let him cook, or that's woke, or all of that language that has been appropriated by the mainstream culture, that all came from hip hop culture. And that is a way to validate the fact that hip hop, for at least the last 20 years, has been the dominant ideology. I mean, think of just, like someone at an Animal House style kegger party, drinking lots of beer. You rock, man, rock and roll. The people who are young today don't say that. The music influences the spoken lexicon. And so we've traced the beginning and the end of jazz as the dominant musical idiom. We've traced the beginning and end of rock and roll. We talked about disco, a subgenre of R&B lost time, and how maybe it's had the lost love because its parent category of music, if you will, R&B in its in its contemporary form, is now the main musical idiom. And then the country and western scene that was always sort of a silver or bronze medalist is hanging on, because like Ice-T says, I don't want to be the boss. The boss is the one who's always, getting smacked down. He's always the one that people want to take down. If you're in the background, you can survive a bit longer. And that's maybe why you have country and western that proves that maybe slow and steady does win the race. So the question here for the people who are either boomers, Gen X, or at least the older millennials for whom rock and roll was this main musical idiom, well, what's going to happen to rock and roll? Well, let's look at what happened to pop genres influenced by jazz. You can still go to Vegas or New York or Chicago and hear a lounge singer that sings in the style of Frank Sinatra. But it's not as common a thing, and it's done more for people wanting a vintage experience as opposed to people just wanting an experience, otherwise known as a contemporary experience. Let's look at jazz as it existed outside of pop music in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In most big cities, and even some small ones in North America and much of Europe, you can hear a trad jazz band, a bebop combo. In some cities, you can even still hear fusion, even though very sadly for me, that tended to die off quicker. But again, it's a niche thing. It's a specialist thing. I think maybe rock and roll might be relegated to that. So instead of going to the Whiskey A Go Go on the Sunset Strip or the Viper Room or Gazzari's or any of these places that played rock and roll music, they weren't really called rock clubs. They were clubs for young people. They were music clubs. And the music that the youngsters wanted to hear at the time was rock. But now I think you might see the term rock being used as an increasingly specialist definition. Oh yeah, guys, I'm breaking out. I just cleaned off the spider carcasses from my leather jacket, and we're going down to the rock club. Oh really? Oh, can I come? Oh yeah. And I think another thing that's interesting is that when a genre is relegated to the niche rather than the mainstream, its subgenres tend to be marketed together. So if you go to a jazz night, you might with several bands, you might see one band modeled off the style of Thelonious Monk and another modeled after the later style of Ornette Coleman. You might see a fusion band joined in, something that you wouldn't see at the time. These subgenres would have been segregated by age and other demographic factors. But maybe in the future, when rock and roll is really an old man's genre, you'll see Rock Night at your local club, and they'll have everything from, you know, a Chuck Berry tribute to a Doobie Brothers tribute to a Judas Priest tribute, and no one will bat an eye because it's all housed under this macro genre, this parent genre of rock. So rock and roll may well never die, but it is entering an extended period in the nursing home. It has unfortunately become the Joe Biden of genres. And ironically, Donald Trump has been featured in more hip hop music videos in terms of references and cameos than any previous president. It is the hip hop age. Now, don't worry, this channel is going to talk about every genre under the sun, as it always does. But that's my soliloquy, my analysis of what's happening with that. As always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.